Have you ever heard of a story where a first impression becomes the greatest lesson? Picture this. You're at JFK Airport, surrounded by a sea of people rushing in every direction. The sound of rolling luggage, overhead announcements, and the constant hum of conversation create a tense and chaotic atmosphere. Yet, in the middle of it all, there is a man standing calmly, radiating a strange sense of tranquility. This man is dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn out jeans, and carries a backpack that looks like it's been around the world with him. He's standing in the first class line. There's nothing flashy about him, nothing to suggest he belongs in this upscale space. And yet, he's there. Can you guess who he is? That's right. It's Keanu Reeves, the star admired worldwide. But you wouldn't know it from the way he carries himself. He seems completely uninterested in proving anything to anyone. Behind him, however, stands a man who couldn't be more different. His name is Victor Grant, a businessman whose appearance alone screams self-importance. His tailored suit, sparkling Rolex watch, and expensive cologne demand attention from everyone around him. But the most striking thing about Victor isn't his looks. It's his arrogance. And when his eyes land on Keanu, something shifts. Victor smirks, steps closer to Keanu, and lets out a sarcastic remark. Well, first class. Huh? Who would have thought? Looks like they're letting just about anyone in here these days. Keanu turns his head, meeting Victor's gaze with a calm expression, and replies softly, "Yeah, the world is full of surprises, isn't it?" Victor raises an eyebrow, clearly dissatisfied with the response. Maybe he was expecting an embarrassed reaction, or at least some discomfort from the man in front of him. But Keanu remains unfazed. He stands there, completely at ease, as if Victor's words mean nothing to him. And this is just the beginning. What do you think? If you were Keanu, how would you respond to that kind of sarcasm? Or if you were Victor, would you believe you truly understood the man standing in front of you? Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where the real confrontation between these two vastly different men begins, right in the first-class cabin they're about to board. Part 2, the debate on the flight. After boarding, both Keanu and Victor made their way to the plane. Victor, as confident as ever, strutted down the aisle with an air of arrogance, while Keanu remained calm and composed, as if nothing around him could faze him. But the moment Victor found his seat, he froze. Keanu's seat? None other than the one right next to his. Victor blurted out, "You've got to be kidding me. Out of all the seats on this plane, you end up sitting next to me." Keanu turned to Victor with a slight smile, completely unbothered. "Looks like we'll be traveling together on this flight." Victor sighed, sank into his seat, and shot Keanu a scrutinizing look. In his mind, someone like Keanu didn't belong in first class, a space Victor clearly considered reserved for the elite. Once the plane stabilized in the air, Victor decided to start a conversation, but not to make a friend. He wanted to assert his superiority. "So, what do you do for a living?" Victor asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Keanu, busy adjusting his backpack under the seat, looked up and replied simply, "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "Film, huh? Like commercials? Small-time stuff?" Keanu chuckled softly, neither confirming nor denying. "Something like that," he said, keeping his tone light. Victor laughed loudly, as if he had just uncovered some grand joke. Taking a sip of the red wine offered by the flight attendant, he said, "I always find it amusing when people try to squeeze into spaces they clearly don't belong. I mean, first class isn't just a seat. It's a lifestyle. It's a statement." Keanu didn't respond immediately. He turned his attention to the window, seemingly captivated by the vast expanse of sky outside. After a few moments, he turned back to Victor, his expression calm as ever. "I think everyone belongs where they are, Victor. Sometimes it's exactly where they're standing." Victor stared at him, stunned for a moment. The response hit harder than he expected, but instead of backing down, he pressed on. "That's a nice philosophical answer. But do you really think the world is fair? Some people are born to be at the top, and others, well, they'll always be at the bottom." Keanu didn't respond right away. He reached for the bottle of water on his tray, took a small sip, and then said, "Maybe that depends on how you define being at the top. For me, it's not about position. It's about how you treat others." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin seemed to shift. Nearby passengers, who had been quietly observing, now began to pay closer attention. A few nodded slightly, as if silently agreeing with Keanu's words. Victor, meanwhile, felt the pressure building but wasn't ready to give up. "You seem like the kind of guy who's easily satisfied," Victor sneered. "A bottle of water in first class is all it takes to make you feel worthy, huh?" Keanu turned to Victor, a faint smile on his lips. "Satisfaction doesn't come from what we have, Victor. It comes from how we perceive it." Victor laughed loudly, trying to mask his growing discomfort. "You really believe that? The world doesn't work on simple philosophies like that, my friend. You've got to prove yourself. Show people what you've got, or they won't take you seriously." Keanu tilted his head slightly as if considering Victor's words. Then, in his usual calm tone, he said, "That may be true for some people, but I believe that things of real value don't need to be proven. They speak for themselves." For a moment, Victor was speechless. He took another sip of his wine, trying to hide his unease. By now, it wasn't just Keanu who was making an impression. The other passengers were beginning to form their own judgments. Some exchanged glances, silently siding with Keanu. Others cast discreet, disapproving looks at Victor. Victor thought he had the upper hand in the conversation, but Keanu's calm demeanor and thoughtful responses were beginning to reveal the stark contrast between the two men. Keanu's words weren't just affecting Victor. They were resonating with the entire cabin. The passengers, initially indifferent, now found themselves captivated by the quiet wisdom of a man who seemed so out of place, yet so perfectly at ease. What do you think? Will Victor keep trying to provoke Keanu, or will Keanu choose a different approach? Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where an unexpected revelation will leave everyone's speechless. Part 3. The Turning Point, Discovering Keanu's Identity. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew quieter. Some passengers continued reading or watching their screens, while others discreetly observed what was unfolding. But Victor wasn't ready to back down. He was still scheming, trying to figure out how to regain control of the conversation. For him, losing to someone as unassuming as Keanu in a battle of words was simply unacceptable. Just then, a flight attendant approached with a professional smile. She leaned slightly toward Keanu and, in a voice polite yet loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, said, "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to let you know your connection to Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his regards and mentioned you're a great inspiration to him." The name Reeves hung in the air like a lightning strike. The first-class cabin fell into a brief, stunned silence. A few passengers looked up from their books and screens, their curiosity quickly turning to surprise. And Victor? He froze. His eyes widened, his confident demeanor shattered. "Reeves?" Victor stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean you're Keanu Reeves? The actor?" Keanu turned toward him, his calm expression unchanged, and nodded with a small, polite smile. "Yes, that's me." Victor's face flushed red as he stared at Keanu, as if trying to reconcile the humble man sitting next to him with the Hollywood superstar admired by millions. It only left him more flustered. Why didn't you say anything?" Victor stammered. "I mean, I've said some things. If I'd known who you were, I wouldn't have." Keanu interrupted him with a gentle yet firm tone, his words carrying an undeniable weight. "My identity doesn't matter, Victor. What matters is how you treat others, no matter who you think they are." Victor sat back, his mouth slightly open as he processed Keanu's response. The words hit like a gut punch, shattering his arrogance. He fumbled for words, but nothing coherent came out. Around them, murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers whispered about Keanu's humility, while others exchanged knowing glances at Victor's discomfort. A couple seated near the front shook their heads slightly, clearly having witnessed the entire exchange. Victor tried to muster some semblance of dignity, saying, "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't know who I was talking to. If I'd known." Keanu shook his head, cutting him off again, this time with more conviction. "Victor, the way you treat someone shouldn't change just because you know who they are. True respect comes from treating everyone with kindness, whether they're a celebrity, a businessman, or anyone else." Victor looked down, his confidence evaporating. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, dismantling the facade he had so carefully built. The cabin grew heavier with tension. Victor, who had carried himself with so much pride and arrogance just moments ago, now looked like a child caught in the act. He rubbed his face, took a deep breath, and sat in silence as if trying to absorb the lesson Keanu had just imparted. But this wasn't the end. What would follow next would give Victor even more to reflect on. Closing part 3. Victor began to see the cracks in his behavior, though he wasn't yet ready to fully accept his mistakes. Keanu, without any intention of humiliating him, had delivered a profound lesson through his humility and grace. What do you think Victor will do next? Will he have the courage to change? Stay tuned for part 4, where the final lesson unfolds, turning this flight into an unforgettable milestone. Tash! Part 4, the climax and the final lesson. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavy. Victor, who once sat upright with an air of arrogance, now seemed smaller, unsure of himself. He remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers around him, while Keanu continued to sit with his usual calmness as if nothing had happened. After a while, Victor broke the silence. He turned to Keanu, his voice quieter than before, stripped of the self-importance that once filled it. You know, I'm not a bad person. I've spent my whole life having to prove myself. In my world, if you don't show people your worth, they'll walk all over you like you don't even exist. Keanu listened intently, his expression full of understanding. He leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together on his knees, and responded, I get it. The world can be a tough place, and sometimes we feel like we have to do whatever it takes to be seen or acknowledged. But Victor, your value doesn't come from what you can show off. It comes from the way you make others feel about themselves. Victor furrowed his brows, as though Keanu's words had struck a hidden chord within him. He looked down at his hands, clasped tightly together, and could almost feel the eyes of the other passengers still on him. To be honest, Victor began, his tone softer, I don't think of myself as someone who judges others. But you're right. I've been so focused on protecting my image that I forgot how important it is to treat people well. Keanu nodded, his gaze free of judgment, instead offering a sense of gentle encouragement. Realizing that is the first step. What matters most is what you choose to do from here. Victor sat in silence for a moment, then let out a small laugh, as if laughing at himself. You sound like a philosopher, he said, shaking his head. But I think you're right. A few hours ago, I looked down on you just because of how you dressed. Now, I feel embarrassed by my own behavior. Keanu smiled faintly, his voice soft yet filled with meaning. Don't be too hard on yourself. We've all made mistakes. What's important is what we learn from them. A lesson for everyone. The passengers nearby, who had been quietly observing the exchange from the start, now seemed to take their own lessons from it. A few nodded subtly, resonating with Keanu's words. An older woman sitting a few rows away smiled warmly, clearly impressed by Keanu's humility and grace. Victor turned to Keanu again, his voice now filled with sincerity. I owe you an apology, not because you're Keanu Reeves, but because you've reminded me of something I think I forgot a long time ago. Thank you. Not just for your patience, but for helping me see things differently. Keanu nodded, returning a genuine smile. I didn't do anything special, Victor. We all have lessons to learn in this life, and sometimes they come from the most unexpected places. A meaningful ending. The plane began its descent, preparing for landing. As the announcement played, the passengers adjusted their belongings and fastened their seatbelts. Nobody spoke further. But the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had undeniably shifted. When the plane landed, Victor hesitated for a moment before standing. He looked at Keanu, as though he wanted to say something more. But instead, he simply nodded, a small but heartfelt gesture of respect. Keanu returned the gesture with a warm smile before walking out of the cabin with his usual composed demeanor. Outside, a small group of fans eagerly awaited Keanu. He greeted them with his trademark patience and kindness, taking photos and signing autographs without a hint of arrogance. Meanwhile, Victor stood a few steps behind, watching silently. He let out a sigh, but it wasn't one of regret. It was the sigh of someone who had learned a profound lesson. The takeaway. Life isn't a stage for showing off accomplishments or status. It's about the meaning we create through the way we treat others. And sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the people we least expect. Ask yourself this: are you living to impress others or to create real, meaningful value in the world? Because true success isn't about what you have, it's about how you leave others feeling. Part 5: Victor's Transformation and New Journey. As Victor stepped out of the airport, he paused for a moment, standing still amidst the bustling crowds. His luxurious car waited nearby, but he didn't rush to get in. His thoughts were still consumed by the conversation he'd had on the flight. For the first time in years, Victor felt a hollow emptiness he couldn't quite explain. The arrogance that had once been his armor now felt heavy and meaningless. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched for Keanu Reeves. Dozens of articles, videos, and photos appeared, all describing a man celebrated not just for his fame, but for his remarkable humility. Victor's attention was caught by a particular interview clip. In it, Keanu said, "Life isn't about what you own or achieve, it's about how you share it with the people around you." Victor stared at the screen, those simple words resonating deeply with him. For a man who had spent his life striving to outdo others, he realized he had forgotten what truly mattered: the meaning of real success. The start of a new journey. In the days that followed, Victor began to change. He no longer felt the need to prove himself with expensive suits or extravagant dinners. Instead, he spent more time reflecting on his life and his priorities. A week later, Victor decided to visit a charity he had previously only supported financially, without ever engaging with its work. There, he met people tirelessly dedicating themselves to the community, people he might once have dismissed as insignificant. This time, Victor didn't judge. He sat down with them, listened to their stories, and felt a newfound sense of respect for the sincerity in their small but impactful actions. Over time, Victor realized that life was no longer about chasing validation from others. He began focusing on simpler but more meaningful things. He spent more time with his family, joined community projects, and, most importantly, learned to listen instead of judge. One day, Victor stumbled upon a photo of Keanu on social media. In it, Keanu was sitting on a subway bench, casually reading a book like any ordinary person. Victor smiled. He no longer felt embarrassed or ashamed of what had happened on that flight. Instead, he felt grateful. Grateful for the encounter that had forced him to confront himself and change in ways he never thought possible. A meaningful conclusion. One afternoon, Victor sat down to write a short letter to Keanu. In it, he wrote, "Keanu, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I was the man sitting next to you on the flight from JFK. I was arrogant and judgmental, and I didn't take the time to understand who you were. But because of that encounter, I learned an important lesson. You're not just a celebrity. You're someone who truly lives with purpose. Thank you for teaching me to see life differently. I hope that one day I can become someone you'd be proud to call a friend." Victor wasn't sure if Keanu would ever read the letter, but it didn't matter to him anymore. That encounter had already changed him forever. The final message. The story of Victor and Keanu reminds us: a person's true worth isn't defined by what they own, but by how they impact the world around them. It's never too late to change. A single lesson, a fleeting moment, or even a brief conversation can ignite a transformation. Ask yourself this: are you living a life that truly makes you proud? If not, start today. Even the smallest step can change your entire path, because real success isn't about being seen, it's about making a difference.